Hey there! Welcome to our channel. Ready to dive in? Let's go! In the early access strategy simulation game that our protagonist, Choi Seon-won, enjoyed very much. Not only did he enjoy it for his entertainment and free time, but he also became a master at it. In each match in Perished World, 32 players acted as gods, whose task was to develop the various races such as humans, elves, orcs, and the others into a modern civilization and fight each other. And now the match was coming to its culmination, and the armies of the two remaining players clashed in one last, desperate battle for first place. On a battlefield engulfed in flames and smoke, the two armies prepared for battle, awaiting the command of their deities. Their banners unfurled in the wind, and their spears glistened in the glow of the flames. The decisive battle was about to begin. As soon as the command onwards was heard from above, the armies came into motion and shouting the name of their deity, Nebula, which was the game nickname of the protagonist, they rushed to the attack. The opposing army also rushed to attack, wanting to defeat Nebula's continued hegemony in the name of their deity. Choi Seon-won had been undefeated for 11 months now, and if he could win today, he would become the champion for 12 consecutive months. This battle was nothing more than a small skirmish, and the victory in this entire war depended on the strategy chosen and realized by the player controlling the entire race. Each of the armies was controlled by a real player, and each of them chose a different development path for their civilizations. The orc race developed their physical strength, magic, and rapidly increased their population, while the human race under Nebula's control chose the path of technology and already had firearms. Even cannons that seemingly should not have left a chance to their primitive opponents. But thanks to magic, things were not so hopeless for the orcs, and their battle mages managed to stop the cannonballs flying at them. However, this was just the beginning, and Nebula was already preparing to release their next secret weapon. It was an air force that would wipe out the enemy army from the face of this planet. This was certainly a problem for his opponent, but he had something to answer for, and with a few taps on his virtual keyboard, he summoned an equally devastating weapon. Thanks to his specialization in magic, he was able to summon a multitude of lightning bolts from the heavens, which simply vaporized the enemy army. As battle after battle went on, it was like a chess game, where only a well-thought-out strategy in knowledge of his opponent and his strategy could guarantee victory. Gradually, Nebula reached a level of technology comparable to the period of the end of World War II, which allowed him to use massive airstrikes, wiping out all enemy armies on the ground. And looking at it all from his monitor, he decided that everything he needed was ready and he could finish the game. Not for nothing, after all, he had spent so much resources and time on research. For this, he was going to use one of his strongest weapons, the nuclear strike. All he had to do was confirm the nuclear strike in the name of his deity. At his command, the nuclear missiles were immediately launched, and a multitude of intercontinental ballistic missiles with dozens of nuclear warheads rose into the air from his base at once. All of his nuclear missiles were launched simultaneously and flew toward the enemy base. The terrified and unaware orcs could only point their fingers at the sky and stare at the death flying at them. But the player leading them was ready even for such a move, and only chuckling asked Nebula in the voice chat if he hoped that he was not prepared for this, right? Gathering his divine power into a fist and clutching his scepter tighter, he activated a defense spell. Immediately after, rockets from missile defense systems were launched from his nation's territory, which should have successfully intercepted Sun 1's nuclear missiles. But even that was within his calculations. The enemy's missile defenses could not keep up with him and his brilliant plan for victory. However, he had to admit that his opponent was well prepared and wasn't a loser at all. While the enemy's missile defense was shooting down nuclear missiles one after another and the perished world's sky was illuminated by powerful explosions, Nebula moved on to the next point of his plan and launched another missile, which was bigger than the others. It did not fly straight to the enemy base like the others, but flew straight into open space. There, all the stages of the rocket, which had already fulfilled the role of the gas booster, separated and only the warhead remained. It flew straight vertically down on the capital of the enemy empire, or rather on the main temple, where the emperor was hiding and praying to his deity. When the Orc emperor heard the news of nuclear missiles being launched towards his country, he went to pray in the temple. In real life, in a non-hierarchical society, a ruler praying to a god in the face of danger to his country might seem ridiculous or even pathetic, but in the perished world it was different. His opponent was hoarding as much faith as possible instead of putting resources into research while Nebula developed his nuclear weapons. In perished world, the players acted as gods. They could intervene to some degree in the affairs of the race or nation under their rule, and through this they sought to spread their influence among the rest of the perished world's creatures and gain followers. These followers then produced a resource called faith, which allowed the players to perform miracles to protect their followers and keep them safe. This was why his opponent originally chose orcs as his primary race, because they multiplied quickly and could produce a lot of faith. However, even such an unexpected and ingenious attack did not surprise his opponent, who looked at his followers, only marveled at their persistence in prayer. The energy and power gained from their faith he transformed into another spell, and clouds of blue smoke began to surround the approaching missile. In an instant, it all turned into a huge fist that grabbed and stopped the missile. It was the fist of a huge orc-like creature hundreds of meters tall. Watching all of this, the opponent started laughing at Nebula and reminded him that here in the perished world, faith always brings results. He was sure that victory was in his pocket, and with such an unlimited resource of loyal followers, he was in no danger. Sunwin just chuckled at this. Even so, he was still bored, even though his opponent was not bad, and used a good strategy known among players as Holy Orc Strategy. His opponent continued to laugh, confident in his victory, asking if he could see it. His avatar was now right next to his summoned orc. He proudly announced that it was his own freshly optimized Holy Orc Strategy. This player was the second-ranked player on their server, and he was now confident of his victory, so he suggested that Sunwon just give up. Looking at his relaxed and laughing opponent on the monitor, Sunwon realized why he was only the second-ranked player on their server and had never gone higher. The reason was because he was overconfident. Sunwon, however, his strategy wasn't perfect, and Sunwon was very familiar with it. Orcs were chosen as the main race to rapidly increase the population, and as the believers increased, the resources of the faith were also rapidly accumulated. The missing science, technology, and culture were conquered by invasion. It wasn't a bad strategy, constantly receiving good reviews as the large amount of accumulated faith and the large number of orcs gave an advantage in warfare. However, he knew how to counter such a strategy. Although orcs are an easy race to recruit, it's quite a feat to have gathered so much faith already. However, against his own strategy, orcs were difficult to counter, as he had chosen the skies as his battlefield, so that he could freely prepare kinetic attacks. Sunwon respected his opponent and thought that his attempt at preparing a spirit apostle was quite good. But still, his opponent was too obvious, and thanks to the fact that Sunwon ruled the heavens and was constantly developing his technology, he was able to create and launch into space an artificial intelligence-controlled military satellite made from ancient relics. Utilizing the endless space above his enemies' heads, he was able to place a satellite there with a secret weapon, giant metal tungsten rods, which, although they contained no explosives, weighed 10 tons each. And as they began to fall, they moved very slowly at first, but soon gravity accelerated them to the point where they began to glow red-hot through the atmosphere. His opponent, looking at all this, was not on a joke surprised. To such a thing he was certainly not ready. He could only swear and curse his ingenious opponent, who first threw nuclear missiles at him and now was going to finish him off with a kinetic bombardment from space. He gave a desperate command to his holy orc to block at least the rod that was flying straight at the temple with the emperor inside. But Sun Wen looked at his pathetic attempts and knew that none of this would work. Even if it was just a few tungsten rods. Once they entered the atmosphere, the rods would accelerate so much that the force of their impact would be comparable to a nuclear weapon. And cumulative acceleration of gravity will add up. Despite the Saint Orc's best efforts, there was nothing he could do about it, and the rod simply passed through him like a knife through butter, feeling no resistance. And it was too late for his opponent to do anything about it, because once they reached the ground, the rods brought about Armageddon. The entire capital of his empire was destroyed, and the entire population wiped out. But most importantly, one of the rods hit the Orc Emperor, and nothing could protect him. Even the countless protective spells cast on him were not enough, and he was simply crushed and dropped to Staff of Power. Along with the Imperial Palace, the underground temple has collapsed too. And now all the faith that his opponent had been building was shattered and gone. He was immediately surrounded by many notices that his spells were losing power and disappearing for lack of faith. And when faith fades, her apostle disappeared with it. Now his adversary was confused and unable to control and defend his civilization. The Holy Orc apostles scattered, and the enemy capital, major cities, and infrastructure began to explode like fireworks from nuclear missiles. Eventually, the enemy simply surrendered, and Nebula was once again declared the winner. After the match was over, Sun Wen even thanked his opponent for a good game, but he didn't want to admit defeat and desperately asked for one more game together for a rematch. He was confident that he could win this time. Someone tiredly looked at the monitor as the requests for another game appeared one after another, but he wasn't interested and just left the match for good. Now he wondered why his opponent did not surrender immediately, but wasted so much of his time. It even seemed to him at first that his opponent had an ace up his sleeve. But in the end, he didn't have much to show for it at the end. In the end, he didn't see anything new in this match, but it didn't matter. After all, by winning this match, he was able to complete an achievement that required a player to stay in the top 1 rankings for 12 months. And just when he was about to go rest, a notification suddenly came, which caught his attention. At first he thought it was someone texting him at such a late hour, and he was already wondering who it was. But when he clicked on the notification, an astonishing achievement greeting appeared in front of him. It turned out that he was the only player who had completed all the achievements so far. But then he wondered if this might mean that they would cut off his access to beta testing, because that would be unfair. The next message dispelled all his doubts. The beta testing period was really over, and the game was about to be open to everyone. But thanks to his achievements, he had a chance to try out the game before it was released to everyone. He was a bit surprised by this offer, but still, he liked the game a lot and wanted to see what the real game would be like. So when a notification popped up asking him to enter the game, someone decided to try it without a doubt and clicked the yes button. Suddenly, everything around him went dark, and he began to fall into the void surrounded by streams of binary code. Someone thought he had lost consciousness, but that was not the case. When his vision cleared, the night sky, which he had thought was pitch black, was not quite empty, but filled with many stars. He looked around and realized he was in the middle of some kind of space temple. But then, after some thought, he realized that it looked more like a ruin. Looking around, he wondered if he was dreaming. After all, he looked exactly like his in-game avatar. Suddenly, as if reading his mind, a voice sounded from behind him, assuring him that it wasn't a dream. It turned out to be a woman wearing a hooded robe, and her face was barely visible. She announced that our protagonist had also been chosen and called his nickname Nebula. To begin with, she decided to introduce herself. Her name was Alden. Qianwen first asked her the logical question, how did she know his name? But more than that, he was interested in something else that caught his attention, a set of blurry shadows that stood nearby. He wondered who they were. The hooded woman replied that she was wondering if any of the players would know each other. So for there to be fair game, everyone received a mask. She went on to say that she knew everyone. Here was wondering what was ahead of them, so she suggested getting straight to the point. She raised her hands high in the air, pointing to a planet that looked suspiciously like Earth. Although it looked that way at first glance, Sun Wun realized it wasn't. He had simply seen this planet too many times, and now he simply couldn't confuse it with anything else. This was the perished world. The mysterious woman solemnly announced that here and now, in the boundlessness of perished world, all the players present would become true gods. After all, the game they had all played before, Perished World, was based on the real world, and all these countless matches were practice games before the one that was about to begin. This was where they would become true gods. On the platform were dozens of humanoid creatures who stood in groups without dropping a word. They were all surrounded by an impenetrable darkness that created the right atmosphere. Sunwin couldn't hear any sound, but he could feel the vibrations with his microfibers. There were even people that stood alone. Perhaps they were just embarrassed to socialize. Perished World isn't just a world that exists in games, reasoned the guy analyzing the situation he got into. This planet was just like the regular Earth, the same blue ball flying through space, except that unlike the original, it had been abandoned by the gods because of the sad events of the past. On this planet, a once brilliant civilization flourished. The various races of creatures lived in harmony. The race of armed foxes saddled the white weasels that acted as horses here. Orcs worked alongside elves and platypuses in laboratories for the benefit of their comrades. All was at peace. However, not everything was so smooth. For reasons unknown, the gods had abandoned this place. Having the bodies of the dragons on this land, they felt threatened for their lives and flew off in an unknown direction, erasing their traces behind them. The time for new gods had come. All the players gathered around the heavy granite table where Aldine stood and narrated the rules of participation. The Perished World game was created to find suitable new candidates for this planet. Only once tried out of boredom could any player become a god. It is essentially similar to the original Perished World game. At first, only inferior beings that have lost everything in their lives will trust the player. But if you are lucky enough to increase the number of believers, there is a huge chance to become the one and only god of this planet. The world will be only yours, and no one will dare to argue with the Supreme Being. God dares to do whatever his heart desires. All desires that you have ever dreamed of can be realized. This is a possibility only for the God of that world. It was a wonderful offer that beckoned with its possibilities, enticing greedy people. Someone nodded, but it was noticeable that Aldine wasn't saying something. "What happens if I surrender here?" the young man asked, wanting to hear as many details as possible. However, if one surrenders now, one will simply go back to one's daily life. As a payment for the game, the person will lose all memories of this place. But what happens if one surrenders in the middle of a challenge? There is no such clause. It was simply impossible to give up. What happens if I'm defeated by another god? The guy kept on fixing the skull of the ungulate on his head. In that case, the loser would meet a divine end. The watchers will welcome such a spectacle. It will be great entertainment for them. This was the answer that someone had expected. If it was a game where the winner takes all, it made sense that the participants would have to risk their lives. And if it was a competition in the real world, like the Perished World game, then it might be necessary to risk more than just lives. Divine ending, no matter how you look at it, only meant one thing: death. They aren't squeamish about killing people for risking their lives. Extinction threatens everyone. There's only one winner. There was simply no reason for the guy here to give up. Someone wanted to ask a few more questions, but Aldine reached out his hand and stopped him. Well, now it was time to choose. Shifting the cardboard cards in his hands, the man asked everyone who wanted to surrender to inform the organizers right now. But for those who wished to accept the challenge, he laid the cards face up. The remaining contestants begin their journey by choosing a small area of land. This is really an event that is so similar to the game of the same name, meaning that the beginning consists of choosing a small area of favorable land to rule. Looking around, it seemed that some people started whispering. It was abundantly clear that they wanted to give up. 5 individuals immediately decided to leave the competition. They cared about their skin. Apparently, the starting number of people was equal to the maximum number of participants in the game, which was 30 all individuals. This meant that the final number of people was already 27, an elementary calculation, but it would be much better if half of them were eliminated as soon as possible. Okay, you can choose first. Aldine turned to the protagonist. An unexpected decision for the guy. He hadn't expected such honors. Xianwen only shrugged his shoulders. The order of selection didn't matter, because the cards were good, because they had randomness in their existence, just like in the game. However, since the guy had been offered the first chance to test his fate, it seemed like they had taken the ranking order into consideration. Choosing the first card he came across, he flipped its blue surface to the bottom. Though he knew the details of each territory presented by the game, however, he expected to have better luck. As soon as the map was turned over, a circle of runes lit up under the guy's feet, which instantly teleported him to the designated location. Once the territory and land were determined, the players had to decide on the first species and tribe. The planet was truly beautiful. So was each of its continents, together or apart. Although the third continent was the largest, it didn't have as many resources as the first, nor did it have as good a climate as the second. Instead, it was home to various races and monsters, as well as many ruins that housed special in-game abilities. Depending on how one used them, they could become an advantage or a disadvantage. The protagonist promptly scanned the territory given to him and identified all the species and tribes. The land was a peninsula located in the eastern part of the third continent. A beautiful river flowed calmly past the trees that grew in the mountainous area. Green Frog sat undisturbed in the water and watched the beautiful blue butterflies that resembled Morpho. She did not take her eyes off the seemingly potential food, but the frog was not interested in it. The fish that swam beneath her feet were much more appealing. Diving for a perch, the toad caught the prey with its hands, splashing water around the neighborhood. The prey was very large, another amphibian shouted. It was clear from their voices that they were pleased, for tonight's dinner was fish. Turning to the blue butterflies flying by, they concluded that such a species had not been seen in their neighborhood before. But are they important now? They weren't going to eat the nasty bugs. Sitting on a huge chair, someone looked around at his blue-winged friends pondering the frogmen. They lived on a small area of insects with the lowest win rate. But that only depended on the spelling. Although it was backwards compatible with birds, it was very even useful in the beginning. The starting point was on the eastern continent. This meant that battles were not frequent in the beginning. The advantages gained through early luring only meant that it would be extremely difficult to implement an aggressive strategy. In this sense, a race that eats insects was more than suitable for the beginning of the game, like those frogmen, for example. But what made the guy laugh was the number of tribes. About 500 individuals of different species was a large group that was hard to define as a first tribe. The perished world can have an effect on creatures equal to the level of faith they possess. Faith depends on the degree of individual beliefs, on how much they believe in God and entrust their hearts to Him, on whether they truly rely on Him. You don't have to walk down a difficult path from the beginning. However, a measly 10 believers will do nothing to help. That number is too small to leave any impact on this group of frogmen. And anyway, what can be done where there are no bodies of water? Until a high level of technological development is achieved, no action can be taken. And what about the other groups of cronies? The young man asked himself, looking at another screen. A group of creatures of different ages were walking across the hot desert. They were lizards. They eat insects, too. Their skin was blue and covered with spots of different diameters. There were about 30 of them in total. Too few to be called a small tribe, and they were probably all blood relatives. They were characterized by a high survival rate. These creatures could survive here without water. Even though the number of individuals had decreased, it was even for the best. In this race, there were many sickly, a few elderly lizards, and one object was almost crawling to the end of the pack while dying. It's understandable he's from the original group. Perhaps he had been pushed lower in rank in the power struggle. However, there was little to gain. The more he feels abandoned by this world, the harder and more tired he feels. If he wants revenge, life, and other benefits, he will believe not only in God, but also in Satan. Just a small miracle, like finding a god. But he was too fragile a creature. Such faith would not last long. However, it was much better than frogs, so the choice settled on lizardmen. All the weaker individuals weaved to the back of their small pack, especially the injured lizardmen lagged behind. The wound healed poorly due to poor nutrition and became inflamed with every step, which was slow due to weakness. The pack was barely surviving on their wanderings. They were weakened. The already thin for their build, the creature's cheeks sunken in and ribs began to show. Not everyone could hunt, and there were only small birds and stray animals in such deserts. "Hey, look, there's a gazelle!" shouted one of the pack in surprise. They did not believe in the reality of what was happening. In front of them lay a wounded ungulate that was waiting for its death. Its leg was broken, so it could not run away. The crowd all rushed at the poor animal trying to grab a tidbit. One prey, and about 30 hungry. How long it had been since they'd eaten meat. Without tools, they tore the poor gazelle apart, spilling fresh blood onto the heated sand. This event was clearly not for the old and wounded, where they could not compete with the strength of healthy tribesmen. The lizardmen ate the fresh meat with great gusto, slurping loudly all around. It was gone in an instant, but there were still bones to nibble. The marrow in the tubular bones was also usable. One of the tribe wanted to try the delicacy, but it was not to be. The girl took away the leftovers. They had had enough, something to leave for those unable to hunt. She gathered all the bones into a pile and so kindly took them to the other hungry people. It's a good thing to be hungry. Considering they'd been starving for days, it was a gift from heaven. Saliva dripping in every direction, they gnawed on the bones and drank the liquid from them. They grabbed at them as if they were the last chance to live. Only the deeply wounded lizard sat by itself behind a rock, grudgingly gnawing on a bone. The gnats flying around the wound made him a little uneasy, but it was bearable compared to the pain he endured. Rack a rack and took it for granted. Clearly, those who hunted had to eat more meat. Those who could not hunt should have been grateful for even being given leftovers. After all, the group could have simply left the weak and wounded to reduce the number of hungry mouths, but they didn't do that, at least not yet. While the others tended to the marrow, the main pack spoke of the wounded, asking Jael if she was really satisfied with everything. But whether pretending or not, she really didn't know what they were talking about. She questioned what they meant. The most unceremonious man gave his opinion. He didn't care if they were old or young, but that guy was going to die soon. Everyone knew that very well, for his wound was festering. In fact, he should have been dead by now. No one knew what contributed to it, but he kept up the good work and kept up with everyone. Many people survived because Rockrak blocked the saber-toothed tiger. He was the only one to face the predator when everyone else turned and ran. Thanks to him, other than his wounds, the group was unharmed. If it hadn't been for the lad, many would have been killed or injured, and at worst, the entire group could have collapsed. They were already a pack, that had been kicked out of the larger tribe for their weakness and illnesses, so without Rakrak, it would have been hard for them to keep themselves alive. He even managed to live longer than everyone expected. Everyone knows this and appreciates it. However, still most individuals would die. There really wasn't enough food. They had to be honest with themselves. With this kind of life, natural selection played an important role. There was no point in giving all the most nutritious food to the sick. It would just prolong their lives for another day. Taking a break near a small rock, the Lizardmen settled down to sleep in groups. The full moon illuminated all the surroundings like a lamp in a child's room. Rakrak alone slept by himself, holding on to a throbbing wound. His already restless sleep was disturbed by the quiet flapping of wings above his ear. A familiar morpho butterfly began circling near him, shining even brighter in the moonlight. It came closer and closer to his face, forcing him to pay attention to it. Rising a little, the lizard man looked at its behavior. She did not fly away, but only fluttered over his head. She seemed to be beckoning to him, calling him to follow her to the mountain near where they had stopped, and he agreed, standing up as quietly as possible. The other tribesmen heard the shuffling of Rakrak's feet and woke the others. Their comrade was going somewhere. They watched him. Some even thought he had finally decided to leave the group, taking such a heavy burden off their shoulders. The whole tribe agreed to watch him for now. What was he going to do climbing higher and higher up the cliff? Meanwhile, he climbed further and further up, as if mesmerized by a butterfly. It was hard, but he didn't give up. Was this his crazy fantasy in its death agony? He was the only one who responded to the call of the scaly wing. Maybe it was true. But if what he was seeing right in front of him was true, that meant it was real. Following the butterfly farther and farther up, his surprise was unparalleled. His eyes rounded to the size of a huge plate, and his jaw hung open. Insects. A huge swarm of bugs that crawled all over each other created an extension of the mountain. They didn't fly away. They didn't dodge. As if mesmerized, they climbed around, determined to become easy food themselves. This amount of food made his thoughts clouded and his breathing hitched. He was hungry. This amount would be enough for the entire pack. The group of lizard men, 102 to 1, experienced a miracle. Seeing the system message in front of him, Sun Woon felt relieved. Just as Aldine had said, the interface was the same as in the Perished World game. In the insect's small area, one could create or control insects using the faith points. Naturally, creating and controlling them was different from the game. The observers finally recognized it as a miracle. Now the guy could breathe out a sigh of relief. Thank God, whispered through his mask. The first step had been taken. The amount of bugs sent by the protagonist was enough to feed the entire group for days to come. Then the guy's next step was to ensure that different swarms of beetles would steadily appear day by day. The lizardmen themselves announced the miracle by addressing the butterfly, as if they knew she was the one behind everything. Indeed, people with high willpower could take care of everything on their own, however. Why would they do so at this point? Intelligent beings knew that miracles were amazing, and after they were repeated, the lizardmen would attribute these miracles to some creature. They realized that such occurrences were not random, but inevitable. A beetle on the arm of one of the tribes sat quietly crossing its legs. The Rakrak tribe recognized the divinity of the nameless beetle god. But why a beetle and not a butterfly? Beetle god, a ridiculous name for a beetle, thought someone. No one seemed to have a great name at first. Just as an intelligent creature develops civilization and technology, a god's name changes too. They might have noticed his divinity after the miracle, but it wasn't enough. Still, this tribe will become very even important to the protagonist. If everything went according to Sun Wun's plan, he would be able to achieve what he wanted with the next miracle. Of course, this also applied to the wounded tribe protector. A strange blue butterfly accompanied them day after day wherever they went. Looking into the distance where it flew, Rakrak began to see illusions again. Still, this time, he should have followed her. Unlike the rest of the group, he was suspicious of the strange swarm of bugs that appeared out of nowhere. The whole swarm rejoiced at finding food. It was like a celebration for them every time. "Rakrak, are you going to go after your illusion right away?" asked the lizard man to his leader. However, winter was coming soon, but the bugs kept appearing from colder directions. Not a good thing. If they traveled in that direction, it wouldn't be long before they would freeze to death. Lizardman had learned how to survive the winter, but the blood of their cold-blooded ancestors still remained with them. In winter, their bodies became sluggish. Food was in short supply, and they could only travel during the day when the sun rose. As a result, many of them starved to death. And so, at the very least, they needed to make their way through the wilderness to find a forest with plenty of firewood to keep warm. Under such circumstances, it would be wise to ignore the fantasy now. Since that was unsafe not only for the sick, but also for the healthy, the best option would be to reach in another direction. However, Rakrak didn't think they should do that. There was nothing in this empty, wild, sandy field. Was there some purpose to the fantasies he saw? No one knew about that. But right now, he had no choice but to follow the butterfly. Someone calmly watched the actions of his favorite. There were few believers. Since this was just the beginning, there was nothing he could do. Specifically, he had heard too much about faith. Aside from Rakrak, he was skeptical of all miracles. Nothing could be done about him yet. You had to be above level 2 to bless him. The boy walked bravely with the child, on a sign leading the entire pack behind him. If only they had more faith in their god. Following the butterfly, they climbed higher and higher up the mountain. They could have a future they could never imagine just because of their faith. As they climbed to the maximum height, they saw an indescribable landscape. But still, it didn't really matter now, because now he had to focus on not getting caught. "Listen up, everyone," shouted the lizard man to his group. The nameless bug god had led them to a sacred place. This was truly the Promise land. Here and there green bushes could be seen, for few plants grew in the dry desert. But as they climbed the hill, a wide spring of water came into view. Dense bushes and trees surrounded the spring, from which small waterfalls and streams flowed. A crowd of gawkers opened their mouths to gaze at such beauty. This was the respite they had been dreaming of all these days. Now, they wouldn't have to think about food and lodging. They had everything. The pack rejoiced inexorably at this miracle. Now they would survive. Rakrak had been right after all. There were more believers. Sunwen grinned as he watched the subjects.